You know what nobody talks about? Some women don't choose solitude because they hate people. They choose it because people destroyed the safest parts of them. Because one day, after enough disappointment, enough emotional abandonment, enough being loved only when they were useful, they stopped opening the door to everyone. And the terrifying part? Most people will call her cold without ever asking what made her freeze. There are women right now, sitting alone in apartments filled with silence, pretending they enjoy the peace, while secretly trying to recover from years of emotional war nobody ever saw. Women who learned how to self-soothe because nobody ever stayed long enough to understand their pain. Women who answer, "I'm fine," with terrifying precision because explaining the truth would take hours. And if this is you, if you've ever felt emotionally homeless inside relationships, if you've ever loved someone who made you feel lonely while lying next to you, if you've ever cried quietly in bathrooms, cars, kitchens, parking lots, because you didn't want anyone hearing the crack in your voice, then this message isn't random. Because there's a hidden truth about women who choose to live alone, and once you see it, you will never look at them the same way again. The first truth nobody understands is this. A woman who chooses isolation is usually someone who gave too much of herself to emotionally unavailable people. See, people think empaths are weak because they're emotional. That's the biggest misunderstanding in modern psychology. Empaths are not weak. They are emotionally overexposed. There's a difference. An empath walks into a room and absorbs tension before a single word is spoken. She notices the change in someone's breathing, the silence after a sentence, the fake smile, the emotional withdrawal, the energy shift. And for years, she becomes addicted to fixing what she didn't break. That's how the damage starts. Not through one giant heartbreak, but through thousands of invisible emotional cuts, tiny betrayals, tiny dismissals, tiny moments where she needed reassurance and got distance instead, where she needed honesty and got manipulation, where she needed softness and got confusion. And eventually, her nervous system changes. She stops associating love with safety. She starts associating love with exhaustion. That's why some women disappear, not physically, emotionally. They become harder to reach, harder to impress, harder to manipulate, because after enough pain, the empath evolves. And nobody talks about how terrifying that transformation is. There's a woman somewhere listening to this right now who used to be full of light, full of warmth, full of emotional generosity. She used to text first, call first, apologize first, fight for people, understand people, excuse people, save people, until one day she realized nobody was fighting for her. And that realization changes a human being forever. I want you to understand something. Most people never will. When an empath gets tired, it doesn't look dramatic. It looks calm. That's what makes it dangerous. Because by the time she stops explaining herself, she's already emotionally packed her bags. By the time she becomes silent, she's already grieved the relationship privately. By the time she says, "I need space," her soul has already spent months suffocating. And this is where toxic people always get confused. They think her withdrawal is cruelty, number. It's survival. You have to understand what repeated emotional inconsistency does to a sensitive nervous system. One day you're loved intensely. The next day you're ignored. One day they call you special. The next day they disappear emotionally. One day they promise forever. The next day they make you feel replaceable. That inconsistency creates psychological addiction. It's the same reward system casinos use. Unpredictability creates obsession. And empaths stay longer than they should because they keep chasing the very scion of the person they met in the beginning. But eventually, their body starts warning them before their mind catches up. They stop sleeping deeply. They overthink simple conversations. Their chest feels heavy around certain people. They become emotionally hypervigilant, not because they're crazy, because betrayal trained them to scan for danger. And once an empath reaches that stage, solitude stops feeling lonely. It starts feeling safe. That's the hidden truth. A woman who chooses to live alone often isn't escaping love. She's escaping emotional chaos. She got tired of begging for consistency, tired of shrinking herself to keep relationships alive, tired of carrying emotional labor for people who barely noticed. And eventually she realizes something heartbreaking. Peace became more attractive than connection. Think about how painful that is. to crave love deeply, but crave peace more. That's not coldness. That's emotional survival after prolonged disappointment. And here's the paragraph. To nobody tells these women, there is nothing wrong with you for becoming protective of your energy. You were never too much. You were giving too much to people who were never capable of holding your heart correctly. That changes everything, because most wounded empaths secretly blame themselves. They think, maybe I'm difficult. Maybe I expect too much. Maybe I'm hard to love. Number. You simply reached a point where your soul refused to tolerate emotional crumbs anymore. That's growth. Painful growth, but growth. And sometimes the woman living alone is not lonely at all. Sometimes she's finally hearing her own thoughts after years of emotional noise. Sometimes she's rediscovering herself outside survival mode. Sometimes she's learning what her body feels like without anxiety attached to another person. Sometimes she's healing. And healing is not pretty. Healing is sitting in silence, realizing how many red flags you called potential. Healing is admitting you abandoned yourself trying to keep other people comfortable. Healing is grieving versions of yourself that tolerated things you would never tolerate again. That kind of healing changes your standards permanently. Now listen carefully, because this second truth might hurt. The woman who chooses to live alone is often the strongest person nobody checks on. Because strong women become emotionally invisible. People assume she's okay because she handles everything quietly. But silent suffering is still suffering. The woman who isolates herself has usually mastered emotional concealment. She learned early that vulnerability was dangerous. That expressing needs led to disappointment. That opening up led to abandonment, so she became emotionally self-sufficient. But self-sufficiency born from pain is not freedom. It's adaptation. There's a massive difference. Some women became independent because they wanted to grow. Others became independent because nobody came when they needed help. And those are two completely different T-stories. The dangerous thing about emotionally wounded empaths is that they can function perfectly while falling apart internally. They still go to work, still smile, still answer messages, still help people, still show up. Meanwhile, there's emotional exhaustion rotting quietly beneath the surface. And nobody notices because high-functioning pain looks normal. That woman sitting alone at night replaying conversations in her head, she's not weak. She's trying to understand how people who claim to love her could make her feel so emotionally abandoned. And the deepest pain isn't always betrayal. Sometimes it's invisibility. Sometimes the real wound is realizing how often people enjoyed your presence but ignored your humanity, ignored your exhaustion, ignored your emotional needs, ignored the fact that even the strongest people need softness too. That creates a terrifying emotional shift, because eventually she stops expecting support entirely. She tells herself, I'll handle it alone. I'll fix it alone. I'll survive it alone. And after years of carrying everything independently, trust becomes difficult. Not because she hates people, because disappointment became predictable. This is why some women would rather sit alone in silence than entertain another emotionally immature relationship. Because peace became sacred. And once peace becomes sacred, access to her energy becomes earned. Not everyone deserves emotional access to someone who fought that hard to heal. That's why shallow people misunderstand healed empaths. They call them distant, guarded, detached, number. They just stopped handing their heart to people who confuse attention with love. And maybe the hardest part of all is that many women who choose solitude still crave deep connection. They still want love, still want intimacy, still want someone safe enough to soften around. But they are terrified of returning to emotional instability, terrified of losing themselves again, terrified of becoming emotionally dead, trying to prove their worth. So they build walls, not because they enjoy isolation, but because recovery made them careful. And honestly, some of those walls saved their life. People love to romanticize empathy, but they never talk about the emotional cost of constantly understanding people who never tried to understand you back. That imbalance destroys people slowly, especially women conditioned to nurture everyone except themselves. So if you're listening to this right now, if you've chosen solitude after heartbreak, after manipulation, after emotional exhaustion, I need you to hear this clearly. You are not broken for protecting your peace. You are not selfish for needing distance. You are not difficult for refusing inconsistent love. And you are not hard to love simply because you finally developed boundaries. The truth is, some of the strongest healing happens in private, in lonely apartments, in midnight silence, in long walks, in unanswered messages, in choosing yourself, repeatedly after years of abandoning yourself for others. And one day, you stop grieving who hurt you, because you finally meet the version of yourself who survived it. That's the moment everything changes. That's the moment solitude stops feeling like punishment and starts feeling like power. So to every woman listening, the one who cries quietly, the one who keeps everything inside, the one who learned to survive without emotional safety, I see you. More importantly, you need to start seeing yourself, not as too emotional, not as hard to love, but as someone who carried invisible emotional weight for far too long. And despite everything, you're still here, still trying, still healing, still becoming. That matters. It matters more than you know. And maybe nobody ever told you this before, but the right people will never punish you for having a heart. They will protect it. Thank you for staying until the end. If this spoke to the part of you that nobody else understands, subscribe, softly, stay close. There are more conversations here for the people who feel everything deeply and say almost nothing out loud. And until next time, protect your peace like your life depends on it, because sometimes it does.